The event hall was buzzing with soft chatter, the kind that fills a room before a program begins. People stood around holding small cups of tea, greeting each other, trying to find places to sit. It wasn't a grand event, but it was important for the community. Some were there to present speeches, others to help organize, and many simply came to watch and support. In the middle of all this movement stood a woman who kept mostly to herself. She held a thin folder in her hands, pressing it close to her chest like something fragile. She had been invited to share a small message as part of the program. Nothing complicated or fancy, just a short reminder about helping each other in everyday life. She wasn't famous or loud or in fact, she usually stayed far away from crowds. But she came because she believed the message mattered, and she wanted to do what she could. She had arrived early, hoping to avoid drawing attention. She stood quietly near the side of the hall, watching people walk in. When someone smiled at her, she smiled back politely, but she didn't start conversations. She kept telling herself to stay calm and trust that things would go well. Near the center of the room, a man stood surrounded by several people who seemed very eager to listen to him. He was the type who liked to make everyone laugh, even if the jokes weren't always kind. He enjoyed being the center of attention, and the more people looked at him, the louder he became. He spoke about everything: his job, his achievements, things he bought, people he knew, and every few seconds he cracked another joke, sometimes harmless, sometimes aimed at someone in the room. People laughed because they didn't want to appear offended, but a few faces showed discomfort. It was clear that not everyone enjoyed his style, yet they still chuckled out of politeness. He took that as approval. At one point his eyes began scanning the room, looking for something or someone new to target. That's when he noticed the quiet woman standing alone at the side. She wasn't talking or laughing. She wasn't trying to join any group. She just held her folder calmly and waited for her turn. For someone like him, she was the perfect target. Someone who wouldn't fight back. Someone who would let him shine by comparison. He smirked and nudged the person next to him. "Look at her," he whispered just loud enough for a few to hear. "She looks like she wandered in by mistake." A few people gave awkward smiles, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. They didn't want to encourage him, but they didn't want to confront him either. The woman, unaware of his comments, continued to wait peacefully. She looked over her notes, making sure she knew what she wanted to say. She wasn't nervous about the content, just nervous about the number of people watching. As the program began, the host welcomed everyone, and different speakers took turns going up to the front. Some shared stories, some shared suggestions, some tried to make the crowd laugh. Each person did their part, and the event moved smoothly. When it was almost the woman's turn, she took a small breath and stepped forward, walking to the front area so she would be ready. She wasn't on stage yet, but she was close, and her quiet presence caught the man's attention again. He couldn't resist. As the host announced a short break before the next segment, he raised his voice loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Hey," he said, pointing toward her with a grin. "Are you sure you're in the right place? Or did you come here to drop off something?" The crowd fell quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People turned their heads to see what was happening. The woman froze, confused at first. She wasn't expecting to be singled out like that. She looked around, unsure whether he was speaking to someone else. But his eyes were fixed directly on her. He continued, smiling broadly as if he had said something clever. "I mean, really," he added, "You look like you're here to deliver papers, not give a speech." The comment wasn't loud enough to echo, but it was strong enough to cut through the room. A few people laughed awkwardly, not because they agreed, but because they didn't know what else to do. Some covered their mouths, surprised he would say something so insensitive. Others stood still, waiting to see how she would respond. She felt her cheeks grow warm, not with anger, but with embarrassment. She had spent the entire morning gathering the courage to speak, and now, right before her turn, someone had tried to make her feel small. She opened her mouth slightly, but no words came out yet. She lowered her eyes to the folder in her hands, gripping it just a bit tighter. The man looked satisfied with himself, as if he had accomplished something impressive. He folded his arms and leaned back proudly. The silence stretched on longer than anyone expected. Even the people who had laughed stopped smiling. The room felt heavier, almost uncomfortable. The woman lifted her eyes again, slowly. Her face wasn't angry. It wasn't broken either. It was calm, very calm, like the silence after a storm when everything feels clearer. The man's grin weakened slightly. He had expected her to look embarrassed or upset. He hadn't expected calmness. She still didn't say anything, but her quiet stare made him shift awkwardly. A few people in the crowd began whispering that wasn't right, and why would he say that? Some crossed their arms, disapproving. Others exchanged glances, silently agreeing that he had gone too far, trying to recover. The man laughed to himself and said, "Relax, everyone. It's just a joke." But the tone in his voice was different, now less confident, more shaky. He could feel the mood turning, even though no one had spoken yet. The woman took a step forward, not toward him, but toward the center of the room. She didn't speak. She didn't defend herself. She didn't announce that she had something important to say. She just stood there with quiet strength. People noticed. They noticed her composure. They noticed the way she refused to shrink back or let embarrassment control her, and for reasons even they couldn't fully explain. The room began shifting in her favor. Someone near the back whispered, "Why is he picking on her?" Another person said, "She didn't do anything." A few even glared at the man, who now seemed to realize he was losing control of the moment he thought he owned. The woman still didn't speak, but her silence itself said something strong, something that made people rethink their laughter and their assumptions. Finally, the host, who had been watching the situation unfold, stepped in. "Are you okay?" The host asked her softly. She nodded gently. Then the host turned toward the man, not unkindly but firmly, and said, "This event is meant to bring people together. Let's not make anyone uncomfortable." That was the first time the man looked genuinely flustered. His face turned slightly red, and he quickly looked away. Pretending to check his phone, the woman took another slow breath, preparing herself. She wasn't interested in arguing with him. She didn't want to make a scene. All she wanted was to do what she came for. She held her folder close, stepped toward the speaking area, and waited for the host to call her name. People looked at her differently now, not as someone quiet or unimportant, but as someone with dignity, someone who didn't crumble under pressure, someone who carried herself with quiet courage. And when she finally walked onto the small stage and turned toward the crowd, the room fell completely silent, not because they were waiting for entertainment, but because they truly wanted to hear her. But at that moment, something else hung in the air, something unfinished. She had not replied yet, But everyone could sense that a reply, one simple line, was coming, and whatever she was about to say would change the whole room. She stood there, looked at the crowd, then glanced once more at the man who had tried to embarrass her, and with that steady look, the story moved toward the moment that would turn everything around. The moment the woman said those sharp words to her in front of everyone, the whole hall went quiet. Some people looked away, pretending not to hear. Others stared directly, waiting to see how she would react. It was the kind of moment that could crush a person, especially someone who never wanted trouble in the first place. She felt her throat tighten. Her hands trembled a little, though she quickly hid them behind her back. She hated attention, especially when it came in the form of embarrassment. For a second, she almost turned around to walk away. It would have been the easier choice, just disappear and let people think whatever they wanted. But something inside her stopped her. Maybe it was the way the man looked at her with a half smile, as if he had already won. Maybe it was the whispers from the crowd, as if they expected her to stay quiet, accept the humiliation, and move on. Or maybe it was simply the fact that she had reached a point in her life where she was tired of being silenced. She took a slow breath. Her shoulders, which were stiff a moment ago, finally loosened. When she looked back at him, her expression was calm to calm for someone who had just been insulted. And that calmness alone took the man by surprise. He had expected her to break, not stand taller. Then she said it, just one line, one simple, honest line, but it carried weight, more weight than anyone expected. The crowd's reaction was almost immediate. People who had been silent started murmuring. A few even gasped quietly. Her words weren't loud, they weren't angry, and they weren't disrespectful. But they revealed something true, something that reflected more about the man than about her. The man stiffened. His smile faded instantly. He looked at her as if she had said something outrageous, but the truth was, she had only held up a mirror to him, and he didn't like what he saw. For the first time since the whole interaction began, he looked uncomfortable. He opened his mouth to say something, but the crowd wasn't on his side anymore. People were already whispering among themselves, some were shaking their heads. Others were giving her small nods of encouragement. She didn't try to continue the argument or make him look bad. She simply stepped to the side with quiet confidence. But the crowd's attention had already shifted. Someone nearby muttered, "She's right." And that whisper traveled faster than the insult that started everything. The man suddenly felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him. Not because he was important, not because he was respected, but because he had crossed a line. And nothing makes a crowd turn quicker than the moment they realize someone has used power, confidence, or status to put another person down without reason. He finally tried to speak again, but the more he talked, the worse it became. His explanations sounded defensive. His tone sounded irritated, and every word he added only made people more convinced that he was trying to save himself, not fix what he had caused. Meanwhile, she quietly walked toward a corner of the room, hoping the attention would move away from her. She was never the type to enjoy being the center of anything. She just wanted peace. But that single moment changed how people saw her. Those who had ignored her earlier now noticed her strength. Those who had dismissed her before now saw someone who had courage without aggression, confidence without arrogance. A woman approached her first as soft-spoken, woman who had been standing nearby during the incident. She gently touched her arm and said, "You handled that with so much grace. Not many people could have stayed calm like you did." She smiled politely and thanked her, but inside she felt a mix of emotions. She wasn't proud of the moment. She wasn't trying to win anything. She simply didn't want to let someone else decide her worth. More people approached her after a few minutes. Some told her they respected how she responded. Others apologized on behalf of the man, even though they weren't responsible. And a few simply gave her reassuring looks, as if to silently say, "We saw what happened, and we're with you." The man, realizing that the crowd had completely shifted, eventually stepped outside with irritated footsteps. His friends followed him, but even they looked uneasy, as if they knew he had gone too far. After he left, the atmosphere in the hall felt different. There was a softness in the air, a sense of fairness that had been missing earlier. And although she didn't want to admit it, she felt lighter. Not because she had embarrassed him. She hadn't. But because she had spoken for herself for the first time in a long time, still. After some time passed, she stepped outside for fresh air. The evening breeze felt cool against her skin, calming her. She leaned against a low wall and took a deep breath, letting the tension slowly fade. She didn't hear the door open behind her, but soon someone stood next to her. It was one of the older guests, someone who had quietly observed everything but hadn't said a word earlier. He had a thoughtful expression on his face, the kind that came from years of experience. "You handled yourself well," he said gently. "Not many people can stay so composed in front of a crowd." She gave a modest smile and said, "I didn't want any trouble. I just said what I felt." "And that," he replied, "is exactly why people respected you, because it was honest." They talked for a few minutes more. He didn't ask nosy questions or press her for details. He simply spoke to her as an equal, something she rarely experienced when harsh people tried to put her down. When she returned inside later, the event continued normally. Music played again, people chatted, and the uncomfortable moment from earlier had faded into the background. But one thing had definitely changed the way people saw her. No one looked at her with pity. No one avoided her. Instead, they saw someone who stood her ground with dignity. A few people even came up to her purely out of curiosity, wanting to know who she was. But she answered politely without trying to impress anyone. By the end of the evening, the crowd's version of the story had already taken shape. People weren't talking about how she was embarrassed. They were talking about how she handled the situation better than most would. They talked about her calm voice, her steady expression, her ability to speak without attacking. They even talked about how the man had made himself look worse by reacting defensively, and she heard none of this directly. But the respectful nods she received as she walked out told her enough. When she finally stepped outside and headed home, she replayed the moment in her mind. She didn't love conflict. She didn't like attention. But she knew one thing for sure. Sometimes life puts you in a situation where you must choose between silence and self. And this time, she had chosen herself. The next day, she learned that the incident had spread further than she expected. People who weren't even at the event had heard about it. But the story wasn't about her being insulted. It was about how a simple, honest reply changed the way the crowd saw everything. And for once, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Confidence. Not the loud, showy kind, but the quiet, steady confidence that grows after you realize you don't have to shrink yourself for anyone. She didn't need to win anything. She didn't need applause. All she needed was the reminder that her voice mattered. And on that day, she finally believed it.